The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zer0 Books podcast. Michael Brooks is the host of the Michael Brooks Show. He is also a future Zer0 Books author with a book in the works on the intellectual dark web and a regular guest on the Zer0 Books podcast. This week, Brooks returns to discuss the tragic, awful conspiracy that took Alex Jones off of YouPorn. It's Thursday, August 16th, 2018, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zer0 Books and the host of this podcast. We've started a Zer0 Books reading group for our patrons. It runs $15 a month on Patreon, and the first book on our list is Anselm Jappe's The Writing on the Wall. Support us on Patreon and join in reading Jappe's book and participate in an online discussion about The Writing on the Wall. All of our supporters get access to the Symptomatic Redness and Alternatives podcast, and patrons who donate $5 a month or higher get access to Inside Zer0 Books, the podcast, as well, which means they get access to a second podcast every week. Patreon supporters are helping us continue to produce our YouTube channel and our other online projects like our online Capital Reading Group and like this podcast that you're listening to right now. The music you're listening to right now is a theme to The X-Files, but in just a moment, you'll be listening to Michael Brooks and I discuss the deplatforming of Alex Jones. All right, so we were going to talk today about Alex Jones and the tragedy of Alex Jones, the poor guy, getting banned from what really gets to me is that he was banned from YouPorn, which it cuts into my, hobby.
Nice.
No, I'm confessing too much. I'm sharing too much. It's oversharing.
Yeah.
It's been all over the news. Of course, I made a video about it. And to be honest about it, I was going to do a video about the notion of progress anyhow. And then this happened to Alex Jones. And I thought, well, I got to get the clicks. So I'll put that in there. But what's your opinion about how people on the left should think about the banning of Alex Jones from Facebook and where else? YouTube and Apple, iTunes, and YouPorn, and a few other places, I guess, as well.
Well, I'll start by I'll sort of work from what I think is. I mean, they're all important points, but maybe sort of least important to most important. I know you and I might see this a little differently, but I'm really into in these conversations being really clear about like what actual censorship and suppression of free speech is. And, this, particularly in the market economy we're in and how we do things, which, I'll get to the ironies of that in a minute, is not, Alex Jones not arrested. He's no government. No, Obama fruit of security, Secret Service agents went into his, fruit of Islam. He's broadcasting. People could still find his work. And he's not going to jail. And I think in general, there's been an incredible, on the right, everywhere from like the dark web people to the Alex Jones people have made a lot of hay out of sort of endlessly going on about free speech and censorship while talking about it in ways that are incredibly loose and sloppy and definitely not legally coherent. Now, that said, we've created a modern, information ecosystem where a whole bunch of people's journalism, commentary, including really important things. I mean, monitoring police misconduct is happening on a handful of essentially privatized commons, which we call these tech platforms, Facebook, Apple, Google. And there's no question that this poses and already, in fact, influences and impacts a whole new generation of content. Let's just use that term. And, the third point I want to make is, there's been some kind of like eye rolling. Like we put out a clip on Michael Brooks' show YouTube channel. I think it was something like, is Alex Jones the canary in the corporate coal mine, of sort of, censorship or something like that, of corporate censorship. And, a lot of people are, no, that's ridiculous. Like, obviously, like, even these companies can understand that Alex Jones does something different than, what the National Review does, right? Let's even just keep it just on the right. Okay. But that being said, they're missing a bigger point here. I mean, even a year ago, I believe it was, when Facebook started tweaking algorithms to deal with like conspiracy content, it already had a big impact on lefty sites like Alternet. Now, I'm not, I'll confess, I'm not a regular reader of Alternet, but I know that, agree, disagree, whatever, Alternet, they might cover a story where they talk about, I don't know, the CIA's relationship to heroin traffickers in Afghanistan as part of our ongoing, military engagement there. And according to a kind of generic algorithm, or even just a hyper, sanitized editorial process, that could get put in the same bucket as some insane conspiracy theory or lie that Alex Jones is peddling. And I think that, people need to get, a lot more serious about that. One last example, on Majority Report last week, our live stream was taken down. There was a strike against us as a channel for violating the community standards. And it was because of a obviously sarcastic anti-Chick-fil-A title from several years ago, something like "Hate a Gay, Eat a Processed Chicken." And the algorithm in its wisdom was not able to determine sarcasm. So, this Alex Jones thing, whether people on the left want to or not, whether they just want the individual victory or not, it does represent much bigger problems with these platforms. Then, of course, on the right, and all of these idiots always freaking out about capitalism and everything else. Well, if you want Alex Jones back and you want to be, peddled colloidal silver and racism, well, you better support us in some form of socializing or at least trust busting the big four tech platforms, or there's no way we can have your free speech protected because they're private platforms. They can do what they want.
The thing I don't quite understand is how the media environment has changed because of the internet, and what the responsibilities would be for, say, Facebook. Because there was a time in the 50s, say, when television was kind of a public resource, and there were lots of different channels being broadcast by amateurs, and that ended, and a few big corporations took over the airwaves, and they had control over what was going to be seen on TV. We lived with that for a long time. They had every right to control what was on their network, and it wasn't considered to be a free speech issue, particularly even in the abstract, let alone, in legal terms, when that happened, although it was considered to be a struggle over the commons of the airwaves. So now we're living in a moment where there are these big platforms, but they have not, because of the nature of the way the internet works, they just aren't the same kind of entities as a network for television, right? So they're much more open, and they also are legally protected in ways that television networks are not. if you are NBC and you air someone saying this guy here is a crisis actor, or his kid wasn't really killed, he's an agent of the government, which is what Alex Jones said about victims, the survivors of the victims of the Sandy Hook massacre, you're going to be legally responsible for that person. They're going to sue, the families are going to sue you, NBC. And Facebook and Apple and these companies aren't legally liable as far as I understand. And so their role, because of that, their role is different. They're not the same kind of companies, but what their responsibilities are to be an open platform, to be apolitical, say, which I don't think they have that responsibility exactly, is an open question. I'm not sure how to understand Facebook in that context.
Another irony of it is actually, I mean, this is where the destruction of net neutrality comes in, right? And Alex Jones actually, and I don't know, I don't know this, but I wouldn't be shocked if there was a period of time when the new guidelines were going to come in and Ajit Pai was going to destroy, the open internet. And a lot of, right-wing talkers were doing a kind of like, net neutrality is just another word for communism kind of thing. And they were doing a lot of propaganda. And my suspicion usually goes to like some type of sort of, PR firms and indirect money from the companies like Verizon getting sloshed around. But, the irony is that, Alex Jones did his, anti-net neutrality propaganda, and he's actually maybe one of the first victims of it. Because that actually was, the bigger implications are, the real ownership regulation, as I say, either socializing or serious trust busting of these entities and serious regulation of them and understanding of them as, forms of public good. And it's funny, I would, whether it be they were socially owned or severely regulated, my instinct would be more like, regulate them and destroy the sort of corporate oversight of them so that they can continue to be relatively open and anarchic, right? Like not so that they're like television. But Alex Jones, is definitely one of the first people even as a consequence of getting rid of net neutrality, of these companies more clearly being in a position, not to say that this isn't directly because of net neutrality, because, net neutrality has to do with delivery speed and different types of levels of service, essentially, potentially with pay scales. But that being said, I do think it's a continuum of, ironically, the sort of corporate logic of the providers who want to build in a whole bunch of control and middleman fees. And then I think also, the understanding of the big tech companies in terms of like their concerns about essentially causing controversy in their content. And then, the pressures from Washington, and the political process, which are not structural. They're, either crazy right-wing people suggesting that, Google and Facebook are somehow products of like the left or something, or, a bunch of Democrats whose, big conclusion from 2016 was like, your Uncle Bob, voted for Trump because of a Facebook ad.
What is motivating Google and Facebook and Apple to move against Alex Jones right now? Is there something in the works where they're going to be held more liable for the content on their site? Are they trying to protect themselves in advance of a possible onslaught of litigation?
According to a report by Business Insider, while speaking to a joint session of United States Congress today, CEO Mark Zuckerberg took responsibility for the content on Facebook, rejecting a long-time policy in Silicon Valley that platforms aren't responsible for the content posted by users. Business Insider points out that now that Zuckerberg has publicly claimed that Facebook is responsible for the content posted to the social network, those policies will no longer be valid excuses for the platform's slow response to issues of hate speech, harassment, and misinformation on their services.
Yeah, I don't know about litigation. That's an interesting question. I still would doubt legislation. I don't think that there's any type of serious regulatory appetite right now. But I do think what they're doing, it's funny on both ends. I mean, this is a thing that will, is obviously like a kind of superficial sop, to the center left or whatever, or the center. And then on the other hand, they're inviting in all sorts of right wingers to, come in and consult with them and talk about them, about how they could be, treated more fairly. I think it's just a kind of, I would think of this type of thing as more under the comms department's umbrella than the legal or legislative umbrella. Not to say that they're not all, synchronized and working together, but.
What I also want to mention is that I think this is a very interesting moment for the left broadly, from let's say the Sanders supporting left all the way over to Marxists or anarchists, to take a position on this that makes sense and it isn't knee jerk. I know a lot of so-called leftists who are sort of contrarian, who are quick to defend the free speech rights of Alex Jones. I think that's a mistake. I think it's not a matter of free speech in a technical sense, and his individual rights shouldn't be what we're concerned about. But what I do think we should be concerned about is what you mentioned, which is that we are living in an environment now where major corporations can control the flow of information on a system that's all about free flow of information. And what our position should be about Alex Jones and about the Facebook and these institutions, I think needs to be really thought out rather than simply based on either a knee-jerk kind of free speech absolutism. I mean, I'm consider myself to be a free speech absolutist, but it shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction, kind of a thoughtless reaction. And on the other hand, it shouldn't just be, oh, someone I don't like is suffering, therefore hooray, either. It needs to be somewhere in the middle or somewhere else altogether, really.
Yeah, I think you put it exactly right. And I actually think there is a kind of funny, and this is partially just a product of social media and our own just sort of innate predictability, but it's like when this happened, I won't use specific names, but everybody sort of had the response you'd expect, right? Like there was the resistance types were, finally these companies are getting serious, and, Alex Jones is a horrific evil. And also they didn't think also of the potential, I don't know, but I mean, Alex Jones's website's still running. I think in the long run, him not being on these platforms is absolutely going to hurt him. But in the short run, I bet there's a boom in all of the numbers. And ironically, for his whole narrative structure, which is, mostly fantasy, nonsense, bigotry, lies, and, paranoia and everything else with great broadcasting ability, now all of a sudden it's like, his through how toxic and awful he is, he's created a version of his fantasy life becoming real, right? Of course not for the reasons he says, it's not the Chinese government didn't, give the signal to Soros and, now let's call it that bullshit. But, there are big major platforms saying you're gone. And that's going to feed his whole victim complex and, the whole counter narrative and all the nonsense that he peddles to this gullible audience. On the flip side, yeah, I mean, I think there is this sort of people on our side of the equation completely skip. I know for me, I'm as guilty of anybody of almost covering Alex Jones in a way that's I do think he's enormously entertaining. I think he's an incredible broadcaster. I think his clips are really funny, and and maybe this speaks to my own, everybody has their own sympathy for different devils at different times, but like, whereas, for me, like, I don't, somebody will mention some like, oh, but don't you think like, Bret Stephens is trying to make a good faith conservative argument? No, I think Bret Stephens is total trash, and I have no interest in him whatsoever. Alex Jones, it's like, yes, I get it as a broadcaster, as an entertainer. There's enormous talent there. And I've had to really remind myself, like, not only is this guy, an absolute moral cretin, this has led to real stuff. Like, there was a story of a horrible story of a Black Lives Matter activist in Dallas becoming the subject of legal enforcement surveillance over a Facebook post that was taken out of context by InfoWars. So literally InfoWars misinformation has actually contributed to, the actual surveillance and harassment of an activist in an actual gross violation of somebody's civil liberties, like in the real sense. So, the guy is awful. And also even other things that we might glide over. Like, look, we don't, part of the reason I might focus less honestly on my show on something like the smearing of the Sandy Hook parents is just because that's actually an area where, frankly, like, good. I think sort of liberals are covering that correctly, right? Like, it's a disgusting lie. And the parents, in fact, like, they should sue him probably, right? So that's a good thing. And I don't have much to add to that other than I hope they fucking clean him out, because he's a scumbag and it's a disgusting thing to be lying about and spreading. So I guess my just sort of stance is I don't think there's any contradiction. I mean, I said on my show, like, fuck Alex Jones. I don't like, there's nothing that this is more analogous, I guess. And again, I still hate these comparisons because I think we need to be a little bit rigorous about these comparisons. But this to me is more analogous to the old ACLU, like, yeah, well, we will defend, Nazis, whatever, the most, the worst people in our society, people that if they didn't exist, everything would be better. But we still see a broader implication at stake here. So we're going to make an intervention, but an intervention that should never be confused with sympathy, support, or anything of the kind.
Right. I agree with you. So the question here is what the effect of the ban will be on silencing Alex Jones, or put it, like, will his career be damaged? Will his reach be curtailed? And that's an open question. So that's the first thing you mentioned. And I think there's no doubt that in a certain way, this really hurts him deeply. Because, well, for instance, Richard Linklater put Alex Jones in 2 of his films. And, in very sympathetic ways in both times. In The Waking Life, Alex Jones was driving around in a car, screaming out of a bullhorn or out of a PA system about, the basic dignity of humanity and the need to fight against the establishment and the corporate dominators and the people who are controlling our lives. Not, no mention of George Soros or the Jews. That kind of support from someone who I don't really know Linklater's politics, but I would guess that he is, a rebel more than he's a radical. So that kind of thing is not going to happen anymore for Alex Jones. He will not be held up by any countercultural rebel who isn't just absolutely on the right as anything anymore. He won't be getting placed in any more Richard Linklater films. And that also means that people who want to support him won't be able to pretend like they're anything other than far right people now. I think that has done his brand some damage in that direction.
I think that it already happens. I think this will only feed to it, but I could tell you even just anecdotally, I'm thinking of one friend specifically who I've worked with on some things and who is just, he's a conspiracy guy. I mean, not about rebel versus radical. He's just in the conspiracy kind of matrix. And, and I don't, and actually probably with, more sort of general left sympathies and certainly totally opposed to the racism and sexism and anti-Semitism. But I think but also super, much, events are designed by hidden groups and, crisis actors and that type of thing. And he had already quite some time ago been, thrown off that, he had perceived that Alex Jones had been kind of a loopy, kind of a showman, kind of a bullshit artist, but in the realm of disseminating that type of information. And now he really thought of him more as oh no, he's a right-wing talk show host. So I think especially in the age of Trump, Jones had already really, in terms of his own business strategies and just where the market is, had already made that jump. And I think from what I've looked at the Jones, a lot of that does go back to Obama, because I just think you can't feed that audience without the racial and religious paranoia about Obama. Yeah, I have. And that's what I'm saying. That I would definitely not describe it as left, but I could see that he was much, he would strike me as more of a kind of very, and I haven't been to Austin, but I have a sense of Austin having a particular kind of counterculture and him kind of being a sort of Austin showman, I would say bullshit artist still, but not, I mean, I read about him enough to know that he's reading John Birch stuff when he's a young man. So that the right wing stuff is always very much there. But yes, during the Bush era, I totally could see how people would perceive him as just sort of an all purposes provocateur. But, I also think there was a lot less, maybe there was also just less sort of general political literacy then as well. I think in today's environment, a lot more scrutiny of well, what exactly do you mean by that?
The internet may have brought that on. But the other thing is, I think that if, say, Jeb Bush had gotten the nomination and won, that we would have seen Jones shift to attacking Jeb Bush along the same lines that he attacked his brother. I don't think he would have gotten on board for Jeb.
Oh, I don't think he would have gotten on board for Jeb at all, but I do think that the environment is don't forget, the mainstream right under Trump is just objectively far more publicly comfortable with expressions of xenophobia and racism. So under Bush, I remember looking at that camp, the whole point of Bush was compassionate conservatism was going to be branded as the Republican equivalent of the third way. And the whole thing was George Bush. You go back and look at George Bush in 2000, everybody kind of remembers the Christianity and the cowboy swagger, but he's speaking Spanish. He's taking as many pictures with, young children of color as possible. They're really trying to brand, even in contrast to, all of those Gingrich Republicans, which are quite a bit like Trump Republicans, that they really represent something different in terms of at the very, not even substantively, but just hey, look, you're from the suburbs, you want a big tax cut, your politics are pretty right wing, but you don't feel comfortable with overt bigotry. In the same way that I thought of it the other day when I saw this focus group of these Trump voters, and there was actually a split. It was a CNN focus group, and it was really interesting because, a large part of them were just, exactly what you'd expect. Yes, of course I'm happy with him. He's doing what he promised to do. And I'm glad to see kids being separated from their parents and all the rest. And then there was one guy specifically, this middle-aged white guy who literally was on one hand it was comical because it's how you could have watched Trump and not got that Trump is a bigot is, hysterical. But for him, it was yeah, like, why is he calling LeBron racist? And why is he calling LeBron stupid? Like, he's racist. And I saw that guy and I was like, yeah, that's the guy that, the Bush Republicans were talking to. So I think in that era, like, there might have been just a more general pool of people who weren't like, they were less in a mode of all of the racism and paranoia and just kind of in a more general, like, sort of X-Files politics.
Well, I think that in the Bush Jr. era, that the left was more tolerant of of Alex Jones's xenophobia and anti-Semitism and racism than they are now, because it was turned against their enemy, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of situation. Like that. Like, I don't think he changed a bit. Like, I think he was exactly the same during George Bush Jr.'s reign. But it played very differently when he was attacking the sitting Republican president on a regular basis than it does when he's supporting the bigot in chief today.
That makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense, though, and I also think that it's really, it's a good reminder too, if what you're saying is true, that just like, I really think, conspiracy theories work for right-wing politics. They don't work for left-wing politics, because I think once you're getting into conspiracy culture, you're already sort of losing a systems critique and getting into like a very personalized, sort of moralistic, simplified narrative of what's going on. Which isn't to say, it's delicate, because it isn't to say that like conspiracies in the appropriate, like in the sense of the word that is actual, don't exist, right? Like corporations, pollute rivers and then conspire to cover it up. People, their intelligence is hyped with their rock, politicians lie and so on. But it's part of a broad, like, if you understand capital and those processes as driving things versus like, when you reduce it to a bunch of people are sitting in a room manipulating, and there isn't even like organic action anymore. It's just, it's all been created. And in a way, it's very comforting, I think, for certain people, because they don't have to deal with actually how chaotic and unsettling everything is. And then also, I think it, that's also where, that's usually the tripwire where people on the left fall into anti-Semitism, right? Is the conspiracy stuff. Because then when you literalize it, that's when the Jews come in.
Right. Yeah, you need to figure out who's responsible for making all these decisions that are hurting working people, and you don't have any economic analysis at all. You don't understand what the demands of the current system are. So you just figure everything that happens, like, let's say wages are falling. Well, that's someone's decision. They're doing that to hurt the working class directly.
Well, congratulations. I think also the other thing that's different now about Alex Jones, which is disturbing, but I think the other thing why the conspiracy culture is bad for the left is obviously it's totally, there's no, this is an overused word, but literally there's no agency in it, right? Like, there's nothing we can do to disrupt that kind of like perfectly planned metaphysical process. And that's why, like, so much, all the conspiracy culture is just, well, you sit on your computer and you figure it out. And maybe you can get into a really paranoid state that by figuring out one of these secret agencies would kill you or something. But like, there's not even, I guess, occasionally there's some protests, but there is not a real sense of doing anything. Actually, Sam Cedar, the chieftain over at Majority Report, he did have a line. He said, if Alex Jones didn't exist, the CIA would need to create him. It's like this processing of all of this, rage just into like pure like impotence, right? And I think but I think what's actually changing now is, well, maybe I guess some of this was under Obama with all the stupid protests, the Hitler and the Joker Obama and all that nonsense. But under Trump, it actually becomes a little bit more sinister because when when he goes on those riffs about, coming civil war or whatever, and he's whipping people up into all these states of paranoia and delusion and fantasy, now he's actually doing it informally, but not, Trump's been on his show Trump went on Alex Jones's show when he was running for president in the primaries. Yes. I believe twice. So you have like this, it's like now this correlates with the White House and with state power. And I'm not spelling anything specifically out by that. I don't know what that means, but I know it's different, right? That's a different ball game now.
Well, the other thing is, like in 2003, if Alex Jones is saying the globalists are coming for us, they're going to poison in the vaccines and they're going to poison the water and they want to turn your kids gay and, they're going to destroy us all. They have a plan to depopulate the earth. They're going to kill us all. And what would that turn into? That would turn into buying some survival kit and maybe a bunch of canned goods, right? Yeah, I know it still does, but it also turns into going out to fight in the streets too. It gets frenzied. You get into a frenzy about it, and there are other groups out there, like the Proud Boys and the Patriot Prayer people or whatever, that will gladly take the Alex Jones fans and put them into battle. I mean, especially if you put it into there's going to be a civil war. So it goes in a much more antisocial direction. Both are antisocial, but one's just sort of alienated and stupid. You're in your bomb shelter. The other is, you're out in the streets beating up your neighbor or the black kids down the street or something like that.
You wanted to overrun us and poison us and take our families and kill us?
Exactly, because now it's gone from, Obama and Google are making your kids gay or whatever. So buy colloidal silver and frozen food and all this other bullshit I'm selling. And now it's like, you got to do all of that. But then at the same time, like Trump is on the inside and he's fighting them and, he might need a fighting force, right? I mean, they always do the like, well, we're peaceful, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, I don't read that as anything other than, literally being aware of like, liabilities and incitement laws, right? Like the subtext of everything they're saying is pretty obvious.
Yeah. So what do you think about the fact that so much of the, because if you go a little bit more into the conspiracy realm, than even Alex Jones is in, you end up like dealing with people who are interested in the occult or, who are interested in magic and things like that. Like when I first started a podcast back in 2009, I started interviewing people who were interested in conspiracies and then also economists, right? And I slowly and surely stopped talking to people who were interested in conspiracies. But some of those people I talked to were, I don't want to call them lunatics, but I'll just say, cause they're not literally crazy, but they just had a lot of crazy ideas. I would call them mystics. How about that? Who believed in extraterrestrials and spirit and spirit realms and a conspiracy that was like conspiracies like Project Blue Book. No, not Project Blue Book. Project Blue Beam. That's what it is. It's the one in which here's the greatest conspiracy ever. The government is going to stage a UFO invasion in order to justify taking control of the population, total control. And they'll do it. They'll do it so efficiently and effectively because they will have help from aliens. Do you follow? So they're going to stage a phony UFO invasion with the help from real aliens. That's my favorite conspiracy theory. And by the way, it should have happened in 2012 or something. It should have already happened, I think. But, and that, there are people who like, Alex Jones hung around with back in the 90s who believed that stuff. He came out of that sort of scene.
He said, I was at a public event being given an award dressed as a transvestite, and Jesus is an alien. I mean, this was just, Jesus was being filmed with aliens, holograms. I mean, just lunatic crazy. I mean, just lunatic nuts. I had no idea. And I was talking to Jason Burmis about this the other night. He goes, yeah, he went and printed it up, actually. In fact, get Jason's here, and I cleaned off the desk. Get him to print the passages where aliens filmed Jesus being crucified by the other aliens. I mean, folks, if that, it's just so crazy to me that's what COINTELPRO used to try to discredit me, is that guy who everybody I talked to said that you would call him up and he would just start screaming and cussing at you. And he was well known for that. And just so out of his mind that I don't think he was an agent, though. I think he was a complete lunatic.
What's going on, Mr. Cooper?
Hello.
Yeah, that's one of my friends just called in. He's got an Apache over his house with camera pods and infrared taking film. We're going to play that on our TV show. This is just wonderful. We get followed around by unmarked police cars, openly taking 35-millimeter photographs of us. That's just wonderful, isn't it?
Well, it's just one other manifestation of the Nazi Gestapo police state, which has taken over this country.
Again, I mean, I get on this program 6 days a week, and I know how you feel when I talk to you this week. And I'm 24 years old. I'm ready to just say, screw it. Because you got these people cramming cheeseburgers in their mouths, and they love it. I mean, doesn't it ever anger you?
Well, of course it does. What angers me most is the stupidity of the vast herd of American sheeple out there that think they know something, and they don't even know what planet they're on, to tell you the truth.
No, they don't. Simple things like private banks print the money and enslave everyone. Simple things like Clinton's a transnational agent.
I'll give you a kind of out there author that I used to read, although out there in a very different way. A guy named William Irwin Thompson he was actually a proper, I think he was a professor at MIT, and so he had some other serious academic appointments. And in the early 70s, I want to say, he kind of was on track to sort of fill sort of like a Marshall McLuhan kind of role. Wrote on sort of like communications, global culture, countercultures, and cultural histories. And he created something called the Linsfarn Foundation, which was a major counterculture epicenter. And he was a guy who definitely was very interested in synthesizing East-West psychology, did a lot of work actually in dialogue. He was an early sort of, those conversations where the Dalai Lama will bring like proper scientists to Dharamsala and kind of bring like ideas from Buddhism, but like neuroscientists and physicists and biologists and dialogue. Have you heard of about that?
Yeah. I think I have a book that's kind of like that. It was about with Krishnamurti talking to a physicist. It's a dialogue.
I would say, yeah, it's in that kind of realm. Although it's interesting about Krishnamurti that always kind of struck me was that Krishnamurti really, in some ways, it seemed to me like he didn't kind of conflate truth claims, which was interesting. Like there was that kind of trend in the 70s that there were books, like there was this book called The Tao of Physics. It was all like physics like validates Eastern ideas. It seemed to me like Krishnamurti was kind of interested in the overlap, but sort of like what I'm talking about, like physics tomorrow could reverse and have a totally different kind of mechanical state, but it wouldn't kind of imply what I'm talking about, or contradict. But anyways, it's fascinating stuff. But the point is that William Irwin Thompson was of that world, probably helped create that world. But still was actually very much he was a literary critic, and even his more sort of new age books are still very much like, they're clearly the book of an academic, right? And in this one book he wrote in the 90s, I'm forgetting the name of it, but I read it a while ago. He addressed I want to say Alexander Stitchin I feel like his name could be, but apparently some guy who was, writing some types of like, I don't know, like I think like a pyramid and aliens book. And, kind of like secret histories that are about, secret societies and aliens and all this stuff. And William Irwin Thompson had a bunch of thoughts. And it was funny because William Irwin Thompson, for all of his, very spiritual worldviews, was not writing about it like, oh, that's interesting, but I disagree. He was writing about it as a cultural critic. And I remember one of the things that leapt out at me was he was like, what's so amazing about so much of this sort of like conspiracy culture and secrets of the occult is how literalistic it is. Like, it makes extraordinary claims, but inside the claims, it's like, oh yeah, this diagram is what it really is a jetpack, right? And like, what Thompson was saying is like, well, if you're going to sort of like blow your mind like that, why don't you contemplate that it's like, I don't know, a form of travel that you hadn't considered, or something poetic, or something mythic that you had not considered before, versus literally just like this whole crazy alternative history is just a literalization and a fantasy world of what we already know and experience.
Right. Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting kind of read on it. Like,
if you get to the secret occult truth, it reads like a Marvel comic.
Right. That's what, I think he even made that joke precisely. Like, I think it was literally like something to that effect. Like, this is just sort of like adult comic books. And, obviously the kind of materialist would just say, well, that's all just nonsense. And then, someone like William Irwin Thompson might say like, I don't know, that's a Kundalini experience. And there's this whole Indian literature on it, which is interesting, worth looking at and exploring. But it doesn't mean like, oh yeah, literally that was, how did the aliens fly here? They had Boeing.
Right. Well, it's like, yeah, I mean, one of the things that this is an unjustified, unqualified, non-expert opinion, but one of the reasons why Bible stories don't seem as silly as they are is because they're from such a different time. So nothing quite seems literal, right? But I mean, if you put those same stories into a modern context, they start to seem as hollow as they are. So that makes sense. I don't know.
I mean, I would interpret it a little bit. I mean, I feel like there's actually like, I think you can either interpret those stories as, yeah, I mean, I think what you said, obviously there's a total validity in like, I mean, but yeah, I guess I have such trouble with, and I guess this does, I'm not going to get into it, but obviously this takes me, this is part of the sort of conflict I have intellectually with some of the atheist scene. And I understand that there's a lot of people in the world who take these stories in a literal manner, and that causes an enormous amount of social and political damage. But that being said, I don't think that that's normally what's going on, even in religious communities. I really don't. I have met, including, some very, very, very conservative followers of their religions who read stories in that highly literalistic manner. So I kind of find it, and that.
No, I agree. Most people are not literalist, and even those who claim to be often aren't.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to have a literal interpretation of a fantastical story.
Right. Or, yeah. So, I mean, I find that it's like you're already kind of probably looking at it in the wrong way if you're just looking at it as like, oh, well, I think that that's,
oh, you're kind of faded out there.
I think if you look at them as a truth claim, it's just not really how those stories are working.
Yeah, and look, that brings us back to Alex Jones, because I don't think that a lot of what he is doing qualifies, and I think a lot of his audience doesn't take him literally either. What do you think?
Right. Well, I wonder, I mean, that's really interesting. What's that? There's that kind of terminology of like, and I think it was, it was in defense of Trump, and it was a kind of squirrely argument, but there was like this thing of like, the people who hate Trump took him literally but not seriously, and people who love Trump took him seriously but not literally. Now, I don't agree. I think plenty of people took him literally, and I think that we need to be, again, just more real about the massive dangers of white identity politics and that type of thing and what it represents. And they took it literally. But that being said, I'm sure that there is a contingent that doesn't take it literally, but takes it seriously. Because I'm assuming we're talking about people that are not, like, we're setting aside, like I've watched a fair amount of Alex Jones, and obviously it's pure, millennial irony and, comedy watching. So if we're stipulating that we're only talking about people that think he adds some value other than unintentional value, then I think probably there are a lot of people that don't take him absolutely literally. But then that kind of leads to an interesting question, which is like, and up your alley, which is like, if we take the idea that consciousness is as much at the effect of practice at anything else, let's not even say at the exclusion of ideation, but just the reality that, it's not like you just walk around in this self-contained vessel and you have ideas and beliefs about the world and then you enact them. It's actually that you have ideas and beliefs about the world and then you go out and you engage in social spaces, and then there's all these giant feedback loops that impact your practices and then work their way back into your, neurostructures and stories and everything else, right? So I think there might be a lot of going on in culture today, from even the most kind of sub pockets of the internet. Like, I think people, maybe they started like, that, like Angela Nagel identified that, right? Like, this will trigger the libs. A year later, that person might really be a fascist. There's people who, they like the kind of like, oh, no. And I make jokes like this myself, right? But I'm pretty clear about that I'm joking. But, I'm a Stalinist. I'm a full communist. But now you actually do see little pockets of like, attempts at revisionist histories. So I kind of wonder if, literally or not, the practice informs, right?
You say, he's not true. It's not, what he's saying isn't exactly true, but it's true enough, like, okay, so, they're not turning the frogs gay because they're trying to develop a way to make, everyone gay, right? That's not the aim. There is no aim, because if you look at that story, it wasn't even that there was some sort of toxic chemical in some water that was, making the frogs, and other amphibians be, hermaphrodites. They were no longer sexed. You'd have these frogs that would be both.
And this is obviously a thing about environmental pollution, right? It's about deregulated pollution. There's a book going back, I forget the name of it, but that's been very documented in terms of just the kind of general effect of people's hormones across the board by, just air pollution.
Right. So he would say that, he would take that, and then he would say they're putting chemicals in the water to turn the frickin' frogs gay, which is not what they were doing. And no one's, but then someone would say, well, I understand that they're not really doing that, but he's still right about the gaygent.
Right. Which is actually the most crazy part of that comment. Right? Like that's what's funny to me is the line turning the frog. I think that's actually, you hit a really perfect example of that. Everybody reacts to that line because obviously you'd have to be completely addled and insane to take that literally. And we shouldn't discount. I'm sure a lot of people do take it literally who watch a show. Like, let's not be overly optimistic here. But it isn't like what the bigger point he's making is actually way more toxic. Like, if he was saying it as like a stupid joke to make a point about air pollution, you'd go, well, that's kind of a weird homophobic way of like identifying an actual problem. But what he's actually identifying is not the problem, which is air pollution. What he's identifying is there is this secret gay agenda, which is, in fact, even if you were to say, I'm just catching the gist of that, well, that's actually the real crazy conspiracy theory he's promoting.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Turn the friggin' frogs gay. Serious crap. Gay. Frogs, friggin' frogs. It's not funny. I'm going to say it real slow for you. Gay. Frogs. Won't you fight for your life?
But I mean, but you take someone who's screwed up, and you want to hear me try to draw the chain of logic from that. Here it goes. Modernization. Well, fuck it. No, I'm not going to do it. Fuck it. But what I will say is that I can imagine someone being able to justify believing in the gay agenda based on that without them being just stupid or crazy. Like they would say something like, yeah, well, the chemicals are coming from toxins that they're putting out, but then the gay agenda is to try to normalize this so they don't have to change their practices and clean up the water. See,
Yeah,
something like that.
But the guess in that is, I mean,
and then it's a hop and a skip to say, and besides, that's what they really want anyway, and then you're done. You know.
Again, I think especially I mean, he's not even going to want to acknowledge the environmental pollution in the same way. I mean, I guess he kind of does, but I don't know.
I don't see how you can report on that story and not to understand that this is pollution.
Well, I guess you could. Then you know what? Because then when you talk about the pollution, that's where and actually, if you do play out that whole segment, that's just a transition to selling a health supplement.
Right.
So that's really going on.
Right. It's like, oh, the water's polluted. You don't want to become a hermaphrodite.
Right. That's what's really, really going on. There's actually, that's like the layers. Like, okay, I don't take him, because that's how he's really suckering people, right?
Right.
It's like, okay, maybe I don't take him literally, but I'm actually buying into this whole conspiracy theory matrix through which the whole business model is a whole bunch of incredibly shady supplement products to solve the conspiracy. And that still is at the end of the day the prime. I know the best that journalists could do to find his revenues, that's where the money's coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a big hunk of the money for his, I mean, and especially in early days, that was where all of it was coming from, you know.
No, I actually think as I've read it, it's actually changed. He is gradually shifted from, I mean, I'm sure he still sells, monthly memberships and stuff, but that the real focus of the business has almost entirely shifted to someone said it was like a conspiracy theory QVC. That's how they described it.
But didn't he start out on a right-wing radio network that got their money from advertisers like that?
I mean, they all get money from advertisers like that.
Yeah.
They don't all sell their own supplements.
These are InfoWar branded supplements.
Those are all InfoWar branded supplements.
Oh,
so,
yeah.
Generically, totally. They all have gold diet pills, get rich quick schemes, definitely. But he has his own branded supplement company. That's
wow.
A lot of money.
Yeah. I'm sure that is where he's getting the majority of his merchandising is everything. It's like Star Wars. The movies didn't make the money. It's the toys.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, literally, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's it. So,
yeah.
And then it's funny because then you're actually in the real, then you're actually, the real conspiracy is capitalism, right?
Right.
Right. Then it's like, okay, well, we've actually pulled it back here. And it's like everything else we see. It's like all of the, ignorance, paranoia, racism.
Would this be a bad time to mention that people should support my podcast by donating to Patreon?
No.
Perfect time, right?
Yeah.